Cool, we are good to go. So, hi everyone, I am Jess. I'm talking today about the human nature of cybersecurity. Some of you may have seen me present before. I think it's my fourth time at IRISCon. I'm delighted to be back. Thank you so much to Gordon for the introduction. Thank you, of course, to Brian Honan and his team. And thank you everyone for being here and for your attention while I talk this afternoon about the human nature of cybersecurity. Before I do, obviously some of you may have seen me if you've been at the conference before, but there's always new faces. So for those new faces, I'm going to introduce myself very briefly. Also, in the last year since I last came and spoke at IRISCon, I've co-founded a new company called Redacted Firm. We look at cybersecurity from the human, technical, and physical dimensions. Me personally, I've always looked at the human side of cybersecurity, hence the title of my talk. So you can see a little bit about the kind of jobs that I've had. I've worked in a consultancy and advisory capacity, doing like information security assessments, that kind of thing. Worked very much on awareness, still do. One of the main things that I do day to day is going into organizations and delivering, designing, awareness raising training. And also have worked with investigations and disputes teams. I run the website cyber.uk, and on that website you can see all sorts of articles about cybersecurity, particularly from the human side. But you didn't come here for my CV. You probably want to know a little bit more about who I actually am. So who I am is Dr. Jessica Barker, of course not this kind of doctor, but this kind of doctor. So I can't help when something like this happens, because, as you will appreciate, my work is much more serious. I work in cybersecurity, but I'm not one of these. I am not one of these, and I don't often go to work dressed like this. My background is in sociology, so I work very much on the human side of cybersecurity. Having worked primarily in consultancy, I often get the question, like, what do consultants actually do on a day-to-day basis? It sounds like we don't really do anything. Oh, we do a lot, like writing the word success on transparent walls, a lot of jigsaw puzzles, and a keen focus on high fives and fist bumps. Come on, Gordon, high five, high five, high five. Yes, got one. I'm really good at high fives and fist bumps, as I just demonstrated. And so I do lots of stuff like this. So I do lots of speaking things, talking about cybersecurity, and I'm often in the news when there has been a cyber attack or a data breach. That means you may turn on your TV and see me responding to the latest attack. So you'll see me looking shocked, looking disappointed, of course looking angry, and occasionally looking really sad. I don't need to tell you all that working in cybersecurity makes you shocked, angry, disappointed, and sad on a regular basis. And so I let off steam by doing stuff like this, by doing stuff like this, by making stuff like this, which is an alarm clock, not a bomb, and making stuff like this, which is an excuse to use a hammer. My presentation today, the introduction, I do this introduction a lot. I have completely ripped it off. Freaky Clown, or FC, he is speaking later, so you need to hang around 4:30. You will see his version of the intro. But now we've got that silliness over with, onto the main body of the talk, which is essentially about this. It is about the fact that the human brain, no matter how much you might hear people say it, the human brain is not a computer. It doesn't work like a computer. I read a good article by a psychologist called Robert Epstein, who gave the example to illustrate this fact of, if you ask somebody to draw out, if I asked you now to draw out a £20 note, you would draw something that would kind of resemble a £20 note, but it would not be exactly correct. And that is because no matter how many times you've seen a £20 note, if I ask you to draw one just from memory, your brain doesn't work by recalling that image and bringing up an exact version of that image for you to copy out. What you do is you recall details of it. So that is an example of just how your brain does not work in the same way as a computer does. Your brain makes decisions for you based on incomplete information. You don't remember or process information in the way that a computer does. And so you make decisions that will be incomplete or that will be based on incomplete information. And so what I'm talking about essentially here are what's known as heuristics. Heuristics can be understood as shortcuts. They are ways that your brain makes a decision very quickly to allow you to move forward so that you're not constantly bogged down by evaluating information and trying to make decisions. Heuristics are a quick way of making a decision, but they're based on incomplete information. They are usually based on human bias. And the problem with this is that we then make imperfect decisions. We make decisions based on bias because we want to move quickly, but often that can be not the best decision. And I'm sure all of us can think of ways in terms of security that we see people, that maybe we ourselves, make poorer decisions because they are acting on bias or because they are not operating with all of the information. So, for example, I deliver a lot of awareness raising training. And people will often come to me, clients will say, well, we deliver yearly awareness raising training. We give everybody the information and then they go away, and maybe even straight after the session, they will click on a link in an email that looks suspicious. They will use terrible passwords. They will do all of the things that we have told them not to do. And people don't understand why they're doing this. And a lot of the reason comes down to these kind of heuristics. People not operating with the information that they've been taught, but falling back on old ways of thinking, biased ways of thinking. A very prominent heuristic is what's called social proof. And we all rely on social proof quite a lot. And I would argue we rely on it perhaps more now that we use the internet so much. So a great example of social proof would be TripAdvisor or Airbnb. They essentially built the success of their business on social proof. Social proof is that if you don't know how to make a decision, if you don't know what to do in a situation, you look to other people. So if you're going somewhere new, you don't know where to eat, you look to TripAdvisor and you see, are people happy with it? You're buying a product on Amazon, you look at the reviews to see, have most people who have bought this been happy with it? You're going to stay somewhere on Airbnb. Again, you look to see, is there social proof that this place is okay, that this place is quiet, that it's in a good location, that the person can be trusted? So social proof is really important. And the concept of social proof has been researched by psychologists to see actually how important is it in terms of behavior. So it's not really been looked at, that I have found, in terms of cybersecurity, but it has been looked at in terms of environmentalism and public health. And one of the big studies has been around towel reuse in hotels. So we've probably all got familiar, if you stay in a lot of hotels, you'll have got familiar with the signs in the bathroom. There's one in the bathrooms of the hotel rooms here that says, we need to care for the environment. As part of caring for the environment, we want to reuse towels. So please, if you are happy to reuse your towel to save the environment for your children, then please don't put the towel to be washed, please put it to be reused. Now, the clever signs when it comes to those are rare, but the clever signs are the ones that say most people in this hotel reuse their towels. And that's been done off the back of research. Some researchers had a study where they put signs in different hotels to find out whether this would encourage people to reuse towels more. And what they found is that if you just say, please save the environment by reusing your towels, not so many people will reuse them. If you say the vast majority of people in this hotel reuse their towels, then most people will reuse them. If you say the last person that stayed in the room before you, this room before you, reused their towel, then the person in the room is twice as likely to reuse it themselves. So basically, if you want people to take an action, tell them that most other people are doing it and try and make it as close to them as you can. So in an organization, for example, this would be people's colleagues. Now, when it comes to cybersecurity, we kind of do the opposite. And what we do is we shout very loudly about how bad everybody behaves in terms of internet security. You see lots of headlines all the time about how poor password management is, about how everybody's using bad passwords, how most people click on malicious links, how the user is the problem. So what this does psychologically in terms of social proof is it says to everybody on a subconscious level, it's fine that you have a crap password because everybody else does as well. So we think we're scaring people into having better behaviors. What we're doing is reassuring them that don't worry, you may be terribly insecure online, but everybody else is as well. So if we want to better engage with people psychologically, we need to think about how we can reframe things. So for example, if as an organization you run phishing exercises, I would implore you that instead of saying X amount of people clicked on the link, often it's about 30% of people, 30% of people clicked on the link in our phishing exercise and that's terrible. Instead say 70% of people did not click on the link in our phishing exercise and that's fantastic. Be more like your colleagues. Try and use social proof to your advantage. Another heuristic that we regularly see as a challenge in cybersecurity is what's known as the optimism bias. The optimism bias is the fact that personally, human beings are likely to be overwhelmingly optimistic about their future. So they are likely to overestimate the likelihood of good things happening in their life and underestimate the likelihood of bad things happening in their life. And there's been a lot of psychological research and of neuropsychological research around this issue. Now, where we face problems with this when it comes to cybersecurity is, of course, the narrative that we probably all will have been confronted with, where people say, I'm never going to get hacked, it's never going to happen to me, why would hackers want my data? What's underpinning a lot of this is the optimism bias. So there's been a lot of research into this, and it's been found that the optimism bias it's incredibly strong. So even when confronted with facts, it will persist. So for example, a neuropsychologist called Tali Sharot ran some exercises, some experiments around the optimism bias. She and her team took a group of participants and they asked them how likely they thought they were to get cancer. They took note of the response and then they told the participants the actual likelihood, which is about 30%. An individual has about 30% likelihood of getting cancer. What the researchers found is that people who had overestimated their likelihood of getting cancer reduced it. So if somebody had said, I think I've got about a 50% chance of getting cancer, when they were told it is in fact 30%, they reduced it down. They said, oh, okay, so maybe actually my likelihood is about 35%. For people who underestimated their likelihood of getting cancer, they maintained their optimism despite the facts. So they were told there's a 30% likelihood of you getting cancer, and if they had said previously they thought they were about 10% likely, they said, oh well, I mean, maybe I'm 11% likely to get cancer then. So they maintained their optimism. And this is what the research in the optimism bias has found, is that people will be overwhelmingly optimistic. So this is a problem for our industry because I think when most of us are faced with this kind of optimism, say from our executives, from our users, from our friends and family about cybersecurity, we will try and beat that optimism out of people with facts. And it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because of this bias. So it's frustrating and we wish that people weren't so optimistic. But in fact, it would be far more constructive if we could harness that optimism. Because optimism is actually good for people in general. It makes us less anxious, and it also, very importantly, I think for our industry, is that it actually makes people try harder. And this essentially is really common sense. If you feel that there is no point to something, if you feel that there is no point being hopeful, that you're never going to succeed, then why would you try? But if you feel like there is a chance of you becoming more secure online, if you feel like the sky isn't constantly falling and that the internet isn't so fundamentally broken that you don't have some kind of control over your security, then you're going to try harder. So what we need to do, I think, is to focus less on trying to scare people, less on trying to give them the big, scary, bad news, and more on focusing on how we can harness that optimism bias and how we can give people the tools and the information that they need to be more secure in a more optimistic way. Oops. Moving on to a slightly different heuristic, this is the stereotype threat. The stereotype threat is the idea that the very existence of a stereotype can make an individual conform to it or confirm it unwillingly. So, for example, there's been a sort of decade or so research into this. Some of it was around women and maths, because of course there is a stereotype that women aren't as good at maths as men. So some researchers took some mathematically able students and they performed a series of tests to see whether women's performance was influenced by the stereotype threat. With one group, they gave them a set of tests on maths and they looked at the results. They didn't say anything about the stereotype threat before the individuals took the test. They looked at the results and they found women and men performed about equally when it came to maths questions until the questions got quite advanced, and then men performed better than women. So the question then was, is this because men are better at maths, or is this because of the existence of a stereotype? So then the researchers ran the test again. This time they split the group into two. With half of the group, they told them, we've been running these tests with other people and we have found that there is a difference between how men and women perform. With the next group, they said, we've been running these tests with other individuals and we have found that there is no difference between how men and women perform. So with one group, they remind them of the stereotype, they reinforce the stereotype. With the other group, they remind them of the stereotype, but they say it hasn't proven to be true in this case. And what they found is that when they told individuals there was no gender difference in results, the actual results between those participants were very close. The women performed pretty much as well as the men in the tests, and they performed better than the group where no stereotype threat had been mentioned. With the participants where they were told that there was a gender difference, the women massively underperformed, and the men did better in that group than they had in any other group. So this seems to support the fact that the very existence of a stereotype puts pressure on individuals who are the subject of that stereotype to mean that they don't perform as well. So obviously this has connotations in all sorts of different groups, for example, women and ethnic minorities when it comes to cybersecurity, but it also, in terms of my work in particular, trying to engage people in cybersecurity, it has a big impact with regards to this narrative that users are stupid, that people are the weakest link. The more we perpetuate and talk about that kind of stereotype, the more we actually make the problem worse. So if there's one thing that we can do to engage people more in cybersecurity, it's talking about them in a more positive way and actually empowering them more, moving away from this narrative that users are stupid and people are the problem. So what I'm talking about is an approach that is more empowering and that focuses more on what's known as self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is people feeling that they have control, people feeling that they have an ability over something. And so in cybersecurity, it's people feeling that they individually have some control, have some ability on carrying out more secure behaviors. For example, having decent passwords, using two-factor authentication, not clicking on links. There has been some research onto the impact of self-efficacy in information security, and this was a piece of research that took a large group of business students and asked them to carry out quite a long survey to judge a couple of different things. They were judging how comfortable people feel, how much they feel in control of security, how much they have good self-efficacy, and also whether they actually have good behaviors. The good behaviors they determined by doing a lot of literature review and by interviewing security professionals. And of course, what the research found, again, is pretty much common sense. Those people who had higher self-efficacy, who felt more in control, more confident when it comes to technology and cybersecurity, they had more secure behaviors. They used more security software, they applied updates and patches, and in general, they had just better levels of what's known as cyber hygiene. They just took more care online. So one of the key things I recommend with clients when they're talking about kind of how to better protect their users is having a report a phish button in emails. And we have seen with our clients the impact that this has in terms of reducing the amount of people clicking on links. Having a report a phish button is increasing somebody's empowerment. It is giving somebody something to do with emails that they find suspicious. Because at the minute, what we do is we tell people, if you find an email suspicious, just ignore it. And this is really not very helpful advice because people don't like to just ignore something. People are trained to do stuff with emails. They're trained to reply, to click. They don't just like leaving them. So by providing a report a phish button, you are giving people something to do. They can take a positive action. What you're also doing with this kind of report a phish button is you are priming people on security. You are reminding them about security every day in every email that they read. So priming is another heuristic. Behavioral priming is the idea that we can plant subtle reminders, not hitting people over the head with security, but just subtly reminding them throughout their day, and that will have a positive influence on their behavior. And there's been a lot of research as to how behavioral priming works in all sorts of different ways in terms of psychology. One of the most famous papers or pieces of research was some psychologists that brought participants in thinking that they were taking part in a word puzzle study. Some kind of linguistic study. So the participants were split into two groups. Half of the group were given a simple word puzzle. The other half were given the same word puzzle, but planted throughout it were words that relate to the stereotype of being elderly. So it was things like wrinkle and Zimmer frame and Florida. They completed their word puzzles, handed them in to the researchers, thinking that the study was complete. They then left the room. Now, this is social science. So what you think you are doing as the study is never the study. The study then often begins afterwards, as it did with this one. With this study, the actual research began when the participants left the room. The researchers were timing how long it took the participants to walk out of the building. And for the people who had been primed with the elderly words, it took them twice as long to leave the building as those who hadn't. So that's the kind of idea, is you can prime people with subtle indicators to influence their behavior without them really even being aware that they've been influenced. So there's been some recent research into this in terms of the psychology of security and developers. And I've picked this quote from the paper because this doesn't just relate to developers. This, of course, relates to everybody who isn't doing security as their primary job. Everybody is squeezing security in. Security is a secondary task for most people. So it is not the first thing on their brain, which I think is quite hard for us in the industry to comprehend because it's always the first thing on our mind. But what this study found, it was looking at whether people would be more effective in terms of security behaviors, in terms of spotting problems with security if they were primed. And so a set of developers were given an hour to complete 6 different scenarios and problems when it comes to coding. And some of the developers had been trained on security beforehand, been trained on particular vulnerabilities like cross-site scripting, SQL injection. Others hadn't. And they were given a series of tests to go through. To begin with, there was no mention of security. Then as the test went on, there was some priming around security, dropping in some hints that they should start thinking about security. And what the researchers found is that when there'd been no priming, none of the developers spotted any of the vulnerabilities in the code that they were looking at, even those who had been trained on those particular vulnerabilities before. When the priming began, that's when the developers started spotting the vulnerabilities. And the research clearly showed that participants who had had training before performed better, but that nobody performed well until priming started to be brought into the experiment. So this clearly shows that once a year training, it provides a baseline, but it is not enough on its own for people to start thinking about security and to have it as a mindset. So I've talked a little bit, and I'm just about to wrap up, but I've talked a bit today about what social science and what some of our understanding about human nature can hopefully bring to cybersecurity. Thankfully, we have seen a bit more of a move towards this approach in the last year or so. And really, I think the NCSC in the UK, the National Cybersecurity Centre, is leading pretty well on this. They have a socio-technical department, and they issued, for example, this password guidance, I think about a year ago. And one of the key things of this password guidance, where it differed, is that they said, based on research carried out by Professor Angela Sass on behavioural factors and cybersecurity, they were changing their recommendation from everybody should change their password regularly to people should only be forced to change their password when there's been an indication of compromise. So the NCSC no longer gave what is the technical best advice, that everybody should change their password frequently, to what is behaviourally the best advice, because they understood that when you force regular changes on people, what you do is you force them to incrementally change their weak password. People do not change to another strong password. What they do is they have one weak password and they will change it as little as possible to retain the memory of that password. And so if that password's been compromised, it's of course exceptionally easy to compromise it again because it's basically the same password. And since the NCSC published this guidance, it has then been reiterated by NIST. It's been reiterated, I believe, by the Australian government. So we have seen around the world more of a move towards a behavioural understanding and a behavioural approach to cybersecurity. So the key messages from my presentation to understand how we can use behavioural understanding of cybersecurity would be to empower people with self-efficacy, give them the tools, and most importantly, give them the confidence to engage in cybersecurity. Don't make them feel like they are the biggest problem when it comes to this. Focus as much as you can on the positives, on telling people what they can do, not what they can't do. Confront stereotypes as much as possible. And so it can be important to say, for example, women are just as good at this as men, or whatever it might be. Prime people on security, so don't just think you can give them the information, but think about how you can shape their mindset to think more about security. And most importantly, don't spread fear, spread hope. Think about how we can harness the optimism bias so that we can be more effective with our messaging. References, if you want them, I can send them to you, but all of the papers that I've referenced today and the studies that I've referred to. If you don't want to get deep into the literature, but you just want to read a little bit more about psychology, about human behavior, then these are books that don't relate to information security, but the messages very clearly are relevant for our industry, and they're great ways to start. They're not too heavy. They're nice introductions to some of the things I've been talking about today. I believe we have a bit of time for questions, so if you have questions, I'd be delighted to hear them. I am around until tomorrow, so please feel free to come and chat to me if you'd like to, or you can find me. Twitter is the best way to reach me, but if not, you can of course email me, whatever, LinkedIn. I occasionally may go on LinkedIn, so you may get a response eventually, but whichever way is best for you, I'd be happy to hear from you. Thank you for your time and your attention.